I don't know about you, but when I first sat down to watch the Stranger Things finale, I genuinely believed the Mind Flayer was about to reclaim its position as the ultimate horror of the series. For nearly a decade, the show had built this creature up as something ancient, unknowable, and far beyond human understanding. Every encounter with it felt unsettling, not because of what it looked like, but because of what it could do. It invaded minds, corrupted souls, and turned people into extensions of its will. So when the final season teased its return, I was excited. I expected something terrifying, something that reminded us why the Mind Flayer was feared in the first place. But when its true form was finally revealed, that excitement quickly turned into disappointment. What we saw on screen didn't feel like the Mind Flayer we had come to know. Instead of an incomprehensible, godlike presence lurking in the abyss, it appeared as a massive spider-like creature, a physical monster that felt strangely ordinary. This wasn't the same entity that once loomed over Hawkins like a living storm cloud, poisoning everything it touched. This version felt grounded, almost tame, and that shift fundamentally changed how threatening it felt. The Mind Flayer was never meant to be judged by claws, legs, or size. Its horror came from the psychological damage it inflicted and the way it stripped people of their free will. To understand why this change felt so wrong, it's important to look at how the Mind Flayer had been portrayed throughout the series. Early on, we saw it as a shadowy presence in the Upside Down, an entity that didn't need a physical form to dominate an entire dimension. When Henry was first sent into the abyss, the Mind Flayer existed as something vast and unknowable, more like a force of nature than a creature. Later, in Season 3, it briefly adopted a physical form, but even then, that body felt temporary, unstable, and unnatural. It wasn't the real Mind Flayer, just a vessel cobbled together from flesh and fragments of the hive mind. That's why the finale's design felt so confusing. The Mind Flayer suddenly had a defined shape, a clear center, and even a space where Vecna could reside. It raised too many questions. Why would an entity that exists across particles, shadows, and consciousness need a physical core? Why would something that thrives on mental domination reduce itself to a body that can be attacked, burned, and destroyed? The Mind Flayer's greatest strength was never brute force. It was manipulation. It was fear. It was the slow erosion of identity. Throughout the series, the Mind Flayer's influence spread through proximity. It didn't just attack people physically, it infected them. Will's possession showed how deeply it could burrow into a mind, twisting thoughts and emotions until resistance felt impossible. That was the true horror. So seeing it reduced to a monster that could be confronted head-on felt like a betrayal of what made it special. Rumors suggest that its final form was created from Demogorgons, Demododogs, and Demodobats being pulled into the abyss to form a body. But that explanation feels weak. If the Mind Flayer is truly the source of the hive mind, then destroying a physical shell shouldn't matter. Its essence should still remain.
The Upside Down itself reflects the Mind Flayer's influence. Everything there feels wrong, decayed, and hostile, yet unified under a single will. Demogorgons, bats, and even Vecna all share a visual language that feels alien and unsettling. The Mind Flayer once embodied that perfectly. In the finale, though, it crossed into familiar monster movie territory. Instead of feeling like a god, it felt like a boss fight. And once that happens, the fear is gone. The show attempted to explain this shift through Vecna's connection to the Mind Flayer. During the finale, Henry's telepathic exchange with Will suggested that neither truly controlled the other, that they were partners who needed one another. But that explanation doesn't hold up when you consider the Mind Flayer's established power. This is an entity that ruled an entire dimension long before Henry existed. It didn't need him. If anything, it used him. Henry's story mirrors this perfectly. As a child, he was vulnerable, isolated, and angry. When he encountered the Mind Flayer in the abyss, it offered him something he had never felt before: purpose, power, belonging. That doesn't make them equals. It makes Henry a vessel. Much like Dr. Brenner manipulated Eleven, the Mind Flayer manipulated Henry. It fed his darkness, amplified it, and convinced him that their connection was mutual, when in reality, he was just a conduit. This interpretation makes Henry's arc far more tragic. Will Byers could have become the same thing. The difference was support. Will had friends who grounded him, who reminded him who he was. Henry had no one. The Mind Flayer exploited that absence and turned him into a weapon. If Henry hadn't existed, the Mind Flayer would have found someone else. That's what makes it truly terrifying. It doesn't rely on a single individual. Unfortunately, the finale stripped away that terror by making the Mind Flayer killable. Watching a being that plagued Hawkins for years get taken down by fire and conventional weapons felt anticlimactic. This was supposed to be a god-tier villain, yet it fell with less effort than previous threats. In fact, defeating it in Season 3 felt harder. By giving it a physical body, the show gave the audience something familiar to fight, and familiarity breeds comfort, not fear. The Mind Flayer should never have been something that roared, charged, or crushed buildings. Its power was psychological. Once that was replaced with physicality, the stakes collapsed. It went from being an existential threat to just another creature. That's where the show truly undermined its mythology.
If it were up to me, I would have handled the Mind Flayer very differently. I would have leaned into its nature as true darkness. Vecna's role would have been that of a usurper, someone who believed he could control a god. In Season 4, Vecna could have succeeded in imprisoning the Mind Flayer, drawing its power into himself and becoming what he always wanted to be, a ruler. Then, in the finale, 11 would defeat Vecna, breaking that prison and releasing the Mind Flayer back into its natural state. When freed, it wouldn't return as a physical monster. It would appear as it always should have, a shadow hanging over everything, an ever-present threat. It would summon its army not to be defeated, but to force the group to flee. The goal wouldn't be to kill it, because true darkness can't be killed. The goal would be containment. Destroy the Upside Down, sever the connection, trap the Mind Flayer in the abyss where it belongs. That kind of ending preserves the mystery. It leaves the Mind Flayer undefeated, waiting, existing as a reminder that some evils never truly disappear. That lingering threat would have honored what the character represented from the very beginning. Instead, we got closure that felt too neat, too simple for something that once felt infinite. In the end, the Mind Flayer's defeat felt less like a triumph and more like a loss of identity. The image of it looming over Hawkins used to mean something. It symbolized corruption, fear, and the unknown. Reducing that to something a flamethrower could solve took away its power. And that's why, for many fans, the Mind Flayer's return felt less like the climax it deserved and more like a missed opportunity. So there you have it, a deeper look at the Mind Flayer, what it was meant to represent, and why its final portrayal felt so underwhelming. If you want to see more breakdowns and discussions about Stranger Things, make sure to check out the rest of the videos and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Do you think the Mind Flayer should have been handled differently, or were you satisfied with how it ended? Let me know your thoughts, and as always, thanks for watching.